Ethan Hart had always believed that trust was the cornerstone of his life. From the early mornings in his small startup office to the late nights at home calculating budgets and pitching clients, he had poured every ounce of himself into the company he had built from scratch. He trusted everyone around him, or at least, he thought he did. Among them was his business partner, Lucas Reed, a man whose charm and seeming loyalty had made him indispensable over the past 5 years. And then there was Camille, Ethan's fiancée, a woman whose soft laughter and calculating gaze had convinced him that he had finally found stability and love in a life that often felt consumed by numbers and contracts. On the surface, everything looked perfect. Ethan had money, a growing business, and a woman who seemed devoted. But as is often the case with carefully built facades, the cracks were far more dangerous than anyone could have predicted. It began with subtle shifts in behavior that Ethan initially dismissed. Camille started working late nights with vague excuses about projects or friends. Lucas began sending messages from his phone that he always quickly shut down when Ethan entered the room. Their interactions seemed innocent to anyone else, but Ethan, accustomed to noticing patterns and anomalies, began to feel a subtle unease that he couldn't place. He chalked it up to stress, telling himself that the pressure of the growing business was making him paranoid. But the unease grew, gnawing at him during the quiet moments before sleep when everything he had built felt suddenly fragile. One evening, while reviewing quarterly projections in his office, Ethan noticed Lucas lingering unusually close to Camille at the annual company dinner. They laughed at private jokes and exchanged glances that lingered too long. Ethan told himself it was nothing, that he was imagining things, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something critical had shifted beneath the surface. He started checking subtle signs, missed calls, unexplained withdrawals, and small inconsistencies in stories about where they had been or whom they had met. It was during one of these late-night reviews that he stumbled upon a series of encrypted messages on a shared company device, messages that hinted at betrayal, deceit, and an alarming plan that involved both Camille and Lucas. Ethan didn't immediately confront them. Instead, he watched and waited, driven by a mix of disbelief and the need for undeniable proof. Over the following weeks, he discovered that Camille had begun setting the groundwork to push him out of his own company. She and Lucas had created fake contracts, manipulated accounting records, and subtly undermined his authority with key clients. Each revelation hit Ethan harder than the last, a mix of fury, heartbreak, and disbelief. He replayed every interaction, every tender moment, and realized how carefully he had been deceived. What shocked him most wasn't just the betrayal, but the audacity, the meticulous way they had planned to replace him entirely, to take the life he had built from him while maintaining a veneer of innocence. Yet, even in the depth of this emotional and financial shock, Ethan recognized that his survival depended on strategy, not emotion. The next steps had to be calculated. He couldn't allow himself to be seen as desperate or emotional, because that was exactly what Camille and Lucas had counted on. He began documenting everything, capturing evidence of their meetings, their communications, and their manipulations. He paid attention to patterns, noting how they would underestimate him at every turn, assuming that their careful planning had made them untouchable. But Ethan had a different plan forming in the recesses of his mind, one that relied on patience, observation, and the willingness to let the betrayers reveal themselves fully. As days passed, he realized that part of their scheme required confidence that he would remain unaware until it was too late. That overconfidence became their weakness. Ethan started small, planting subtle doubts and witnessing the cracks form. Lucas would overcommit to impossible tasks. Camille would falter in rehearsed explanations. And in each mistake, Ethan saw the threads of their plan unraveling. The revelation wasn't just about business, it was personal. Every betrayal cut deeper because it was executed by the people he loved and trusted most. And yet, in this darkness, Ethan felt a growing clarity. He realized that he could not only defend what was his but turn the tables in a way that they would never see coming. The days ahead were uncertain, a delicate game of observation, deception, and timing. Ethan understood one thing with painful certainty: Camille had underestimated him, and Lucas had miscalculated the depth of his loyalty to the company and, ironically, to his own survival instincts. The stage was set, and while the audience of betrayal thought they were scripting the ending, Ethan knew he was about to rewrite the entire narrative. Ethan spent the following weeks moving with the precision of someone who had nothing left to lose, but everything to reclaim. He observed Camille and Lucas with a careful eye, noting the way they whispered in corners, shared secretive glances, and underestimated his awareness at every turn. Each misstep they made became ammunition for him. Every casual lie a clue pointing to the bigger betrayal. Ethan didn't confront them, not yet. He let them act as if they were winning, knowing that the illusion of control was one of the most dangerous weapons a manipulator could wield. He began planting seeds of doubt in Lucas's mind subtly, hinting at imagined client complaints and fabricated concerns about Camille's loyalty. Meanwhile, he tightened his grip on the company's core operations, changing access codes, monitoring communications, and ensuring that no irreversible decisions could be made without his oversight. Camille, blinded by her ambition and overconfidence, failed to notice the web tightening around her. She had believed that Ethan's trusting nature made him predictable, slow, and easily distracted, unaware that his mind worked in quiet, deliberate ways, analyzing, calculating, and waiting for the precise moment to strike. One evening, Ethan discovered a folder on Lucas's personal computer, cleverly hidden but ultimately clumsy in its concealment. The folder contained financial manipulations, draft contracts, and emails outlining a timeline for removing Ethan from the company entirely, documents detailing exactly how Camille would assume control, how Lucas would remain as the visible but secondary partner, and even instructions on how to explain Ethan's resignation to investors and staff. The clarity was staggering. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself a cold smile. They had left him the blueprint for their betrayal, and knowingly giving him all the tools he needed to dismantle it. Over the next few days, he worked methodically. He backed up critical files, ensured that all communications were securely recorded, and even began planting digital traps, subtle manipulations in contracts and spreadsheets that would later expose the falsifications made by Lucas and Camille. But the personal betrayal was the hardest to endure. Seeing Camille smile at him, laugh in his presence, and feign affection while simultaneously planning to strip him of everything, twisted something deep inside him. Ethan knew revenge would be hollow without justice, and justice required patience. He began inviting key clients to private meetings, carefully steering conversations to reveal minor inconsistencies in Lucas's statements, planting seeds of doubt that would later bloom into unavoidable suspicion. Simultaneously, he started observing Camille's patterns outside the office, noticing who she contacted, what messages she tried to delete, and how often she underestimated the consequences of her actions. It became clear that they had assumed too much, that their meticulous plan relied on his ignorance, not his capability. Ethan realized that the next phase had to be executed flawlessly. He started weaving a narrative that would force both of them to act prematurely, revealing their duplicity in ways that could not be denied. One night, he left an important client email open on Lucas's laptop, just enough to tempt Lucas into making a falsified response. He then observed Lucas take the bait, sending an email that contradicted prior agreements, creating undeniable evidence of malfeasance. Simultaneously, he orchestrated a situation that made Camille overstep with investors, revealing her manipulations and ambition in a public, incontrovertible way. The thrill of the plan was intoxicating, but Ethan reminded himself to remain calm. Every detail had to align perfectly. Any misstep could tip his hand too soon. Days blurred into nights as he tracked their every move, anticipating their reactions, guiding them into traps without them even realizing it. And then, just as he expected, overconfidence began to unravel them. Lucas grew careless, confident that Ethan's suspicion was mere paranoia. Camille started making mistakes, small at first, then increasingly significant, as the stress of their scheming collided with the relentless pressure Ethan subtly applied. By now, Ethan had transformed his shock and heartbreak into a precise instrument of strategy. He no longer felt betrayal in the emotional sense. He felt it as data, a series of variables he could manipulate to guarantee that the final outcome favored him. He knew the moment of confrontation was approaching, and he would not act impulsively. Instead, he would wait until they had revealed everything themselves, until the threads of their plot were completely exposed by their own actions, leaving him not only vindicated but untouchable in the eyes of clients, staff, and investors. The stage was almost set for the ultimate revelation, and Ethan, once the victim of a meticulous plan, was now the orchestrator of its collapse. What Camille and Lucas did not realize was that their scheme, built on deception and ambition, had become their own trap, a trap that Ethan had rewritten entirely, and the consequences they were about to face would be catastrophic. Ethan waited with a patience that bordered on obsession, watching as Camille and Lucas's confidence blinded them to the reality closing in around them. He had laid the groundwork meticulously, ensuring that every client interaction, every internal meeting, and every financial move they made would eventually serve as self-incrimination. Camille, in particular, began to grow anxious, unaware that her carefully controlled facade had started to crumble in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. She was used to being in control, used to bending others to her will, but with Ethan observing her every move, she found herself slipping. Lucas, emboldened by Camille's reassurances, grew reckless, thinking that Ethan's quiet vigilance was nothing more than paranoia. One morning, Ethan arranged a meeting with their most important client, feigning casual concern about recent project delays. He guided the conversation with careful questions, nudging Lucas to admit details that contradicted prior commitments. Lucas, thinking he was charming and persuasive, fell into every verbal trap Ethan had prepared. By the time the meeting ended, Ethan had a clear record, written, verbal, and digital, of their deliberate attempts to undermine him and seize control of the company. Camille, sensing the shift, tried to intervene, using her charm to sway the client, but it was too late. The client, once loyal and trusting, began asking pointed questions, picking up on inconsistencies that Ethan had orchestrated to surface. Her panic was palpable, a subtle tremor in her voice and hesitation in her movements. Ethan, from the sidelines, observed quietly, knowing that confrontation was unnecessary when the betrayers could expose themselves so thoroughly. Over the following week, he escalated his strategy. He sent carefully worded internal memos that subtly questioned Lucas's decisions and Camille's influence, all phrased as concern for the company's long-term success. He knew that their egos would compel them to defend themselves aggressively, and that defense would provide additional proof of their duplicity. And, as predicted, they fell for it. Lucas started making mistakes in accounting entries, misreporting numbers in an effort to cover tracks that did not exist, while Camille tried to manipulate employees to align with her version of events, inadvertently leaving digital evidence of her meddling. Ethan compiled every piece of evidence, organizing it with precision: emails, texts, contracts, meeting transcripts, even surveillance of subtle but telling interactions. He had transformed the betrayal into an airtight case, one that left no room for excuses or denial. Then came the pivotal moment. Ethan scheduled an all-hands meeting, under the pretense of a standard company review. As the staff gathered, he began presenting financials, communications, and strategic decisions, each slide exposing inconsistencies in Lucas's and Camille's actions. He maintained calm, his tone neutral, professional, almost casual, as if he were discussing routine matters rather than unraveling a conspiracy against him. The room shifted with tension. Employees who had once looked at Ethan for leadership now began to recognize the scope of the betrayal. Lucas tried to interject, to defend himself, but every argument he made was contradicted by the evidence Ethan had compiled. Camille, realizing the scale of exposure, attempted to redirect blame subtly, but her attempts were transparent, weak, and undermined by her own digital footprint. Panic replaced confidence in their eyes, a mirror of the disbelief Ethan had once felt when discovering their initial plan. It was a surreal reversal. The betrayers now became the exposed, the manipulated, and the humiliated, while Ethan maintained an unwavering composure. The culmination of weeks of meticulous observation, strategy, and patience had brought him to this moment. What had started as heartbreak and shock transformed into a controlled, devastating reveal that left no ambiguity. The company, staff, and clients could see clearly what had been attempted and failed. Ethan, in that moment, realized the true power of patience, preparation, and quiet determination. Camille and Lucas had underestimated him entirely, believing their schemes were flawless. Their arrogance became their undoing. And yet, even in this moment of triumph, Ethan recognized that the emotional toll would linger. Trust, once broken, could never be fully restored, and the relationships he had valued, romantic or professional, were irreparably damaged. But justice, delivered not through rash retaliation but through calculated exposure, was his. He had survived, protected what he had built, and turned betrayal into the very instrument of its own undoing. The final steps, he knew, would be legal, strategic, and irreversible, cementing the reversal of power and ensuring that neither Camille nor Lucas could recover their ambitions. The battle was won, but the war, in terms of emotional reckoning, was only just beginning. Ethan knew the moments following the all-hands reveal would be critical. He didn't underestimate Camille's cunning or Lucas's desperation. Both were capable of unpredictable moves when cornered. But by now, Ethan's patience and planning had given him the upper hand. The first sign of unraveling came from within the company itself. Staff who had quietly suspected tension now approached him with questions, subtle hints, and confirmations of irregularities they had witnessed. Each confirmation was another thread in the web Ethan had meticulously woven, solidifying the narrative of betrayal that could no longer be disputed. Camille, desperate to regain any semblance of control, attempted to manipulate clients directly, sending urgent emails and calls that implied Ethan was unstable or unreliable. But Ethan had anticipated these moves. He documented every interaction, every false claim, every misstep. Lucas, now aware that Camille's panic was bleeding into his own strategy, tried to salvage the situation by contacting investors personally, spinning a story of internal miscommunication. But the trail of evidence Ethan had built, emails, contracts, and meticulously recorded interactions, made any attempt at obfuscation futile. The turning point came when Ethan confronted both of them privately, presenting the full scope of the evidence he had collected. He spoke calmly, deliberately, almost coldly, outlining the plan they had plotted to remove him, the steps they had taken, and the documentation that proved it. Camille's eyes widened in disbelief, her composed mask cracking under the weight of undeniable proof. Lucas's confident demeanor faltered, his usual charm useless against the meticulous record Ethan had amassed. He realized, too late, that the betrayal he thought was hidden had been anticipated, mapped, and countered. Ethan didn't need to yell or threaten. The power of truth was sufficient. He offered them an ultimatum: leave the company quietly, or face legal action and complete public exposure of their deception. They tried to bargain, to plead, to manipulate the situation, but Ethan had anticipated every argument. Their desperation only confirmed their guilt. In the following days, he worked closely with legal counsel to secure the company's assets, ensuring that any attempt by Camille or Lucas to interfere would be legally null. The board and investors were fully briefed, with all documents demonstrating the attempted coup. It was a textbook unraveling of a betrayal, executed with precision and strategy, leaving no room for doubt or ambiguity. Camille's plans for personal gain were completely thwarted, her reputation within the company irreparably damaged. Lucas, once seen as a trusted partner, was exposed as a co-conspirator, his career prospects shattered by the evidence Ethan presented. Yet the final, almost surreal twist came when Ethan realized that the emotional impact of the betrayal lingered more than the legal or financial consequences. He felt a cold detachment, a realization that the people he had trusted most were capable of meticulous, calculated treachery. He understood that relationships could not simply be rebuilt with apologies or restitution. Some trust, once broken, could never be restored. But he also felt a grim satisfaction, the deep, undeniable knowledge that he had not only survived but had turned the tables completely. Where Camille and Lucas had believed themselves in control, they were now powerless, their schemes exposed, their ambitions crushed by the very target they had underestimated. Ethan's life and company were intact, stronger for the ordeal, yet forever altered by the experience. The betrayal had left scars, but it had also illuminated resilience, strategy, and the limits of manipulation. The final stage of the ordeal involved carefully orchestrating their departure in a way that preserved the company's public image while ensuring they could not return. Staff watched in awe and relief as Ethan maintained his composure, navigating both the fallout and the operational continuity of the business seamlessly. The ordeal became a cautionary tale within the company, a story whispered among employees about ambition, betrayal, and the cost of underestimating someone whose patience and intelligence surpassed their cunning. Ethan knew the final confrontation with Camille and Lucas was only a formality. The true victory had already been achieved. He had preserved his company, reclaimed control, and turned betrayal into a meticulously executed triumph, proving that foresight, patience, and strategic thinking could defeat even the most insidious plots. Yet, as he sat alone in his office late one night, reviewing the final legal agreements and confirming the departure of the conspirators, he felt the lingering ache of personal betrayal. It was a quiet, simmering reminder that success was not only measured in financial or professional terms, but in the resilience to survive the treachery of those once trusted most. The final chapter of Ethan's ordeal unfolded with an almost cinematic inevitability. Camille and Lucas, now stripped of influence, credibility, and authority, were forced to comply with the terms Ethan had meticulously arranged. Their attempts at negotiation, at salvage, were met with calm but immovable resistance, as Ethan had anticipated every tactic they might deploy. He had crafted an exit strategy that not only protected the company's assets and reputation, but also ensured that neither conspirator could ever regain footing within the industry. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the oppressive weight of anticipation lift. The power he had reclaimed was absolute, but the relief was accompanied by a complex swirl of emotions: vindication mixed with lingering pain, triumph shadowed by the bitter taste of betrayal. The public dissolution of their scheme was deliberate. Emails, contracts, and recorded interactions were used to explain their departures to clients, staff, and investors, making it clear that the actions were necessary to preserve integrity and operational stability. Camille's ambitions evaporated in an instant, leaving her reputation fractured and her relationship strained beyond repair. Lucas, once the charming, confident partner, found himself exposed and employable in the very circles he had once navigated with ease. Ethan, meanwhile, solidified his authority, emerging not only as the rightful leader of his company but as someone whose resilience and intelligence had turned an existential threat into a defining triumph. Yet even in victory, the personal toll was undeniable. He recognized that the woman he had loved, the partner he had trusted, had been capable of calculated betrayal at the deepest levels. The realization that trust, once violated in such a deliberate manner, could never be fully restored, was a quiet ache he carried with him. But Ethan did not let bitterness dominate. Instead, he focused on rebuilding the emotional and operational foundations of his life. He strengthened relationships with employees who had proven loyal, re-established transparent communication with clients, and devoted himself to strategic growth and innovation, ensuring that the company's future would be more resilient than ever. Camille and Lucas faded from the company's landscape entirely, their attempts to undermine him now nothing more than cautionary tales whispered among those who witnessed the collapse of their ambitions. And yet, there was a subtle satisfaction Ethan derived from knowing that he had orchestrated the unraveling not with rage but with calculated patience, turning the conspirators' own arrogance and overconfidence into instruments of their defeat. In the weeks and months that followed, Ethan often reflected on the ordeal, acknowledging both the pain of betrayal and the clarity it had forced upon him. He had survived an intricate, personal, and professional conspiracy, emerging stronger, more vigilant, and undeniably wiser. He realized that survival in both business and life depended not only on skill and intelligence but also on patience, observation, and the willingness to act decisively when the time was right. The company thrived, its reputation reinforced by the transparency and integrity Ethan had demonstrated. Camille and Lucas's names became synonymous with ambition and done by hubris. Their carefully plotted schemes reduced to cautionary footnotes, and Ethan, once a man blindsided by deceit, became a figure defined not only by resilience and ingenuity, but by an unshakable understanding of human motives, the complexities of trust, and the art of reclaiming control when the world seemed determined to strip it away. In the quiet moments, alone in his office late at night, Ethan reflected on what he had learned. Betrayal could be devastating, but with strategy, patience, and unwavering focus, it could also be transformed into a proving ground for strength. foresight, and ultimate triumph. The chapter had closed, the threat neutralized, and the man who had once been deceived now stood unshakable, a testament to the power of calculated vigilance and unflinching resolve.